how I expect you to handle me, treat my trauma, and then being disappointed and perhaps resentful when you don't make me feel safe, secure, seen, heard, and understood to infinite possibility.
That's your problem. You're doing this because you're hurt and you're broken and you're projecting it on me. And how dare you do that? I see what's going on. That's not me. That's you taking all of your trauma and putting it on me. How dare you do that to me? That's what it often looks like.
Trauma work is powerful, but healing your trauma does not automatically heal your relationship.
So in this episode, we're breaking down why the real issue isn't what happened to you.
It's the survival strategies that you built around it and how those patterns keep showing up in love.
I'm Emily Goff, a relationship coach. I've spent years exploring how we connect to grow and heal in love.
And I'm Kelly Gardner, an embodied leadership coach and communications consultant. Love isn't theory, it's practice.
This is Love in Practice.
Let's grow this.
If I heal my trauma, I can heal my relationships. What do you think about that one, Emily?
Sounds like an interview.
Let's try it.
I think that it can be taken too far. And I'm all about the nuance, and I think that there's enormous value. I have been the person who has been all about unpacking my own trauma too. For years, I was that person. And I think that but at a certain point, it starts to become redundant in the sense, and I want to be really careful about this because I'm not saying that your trauma itself is redundant. I'm talking about the impact of uncovering more and more trauma in terms of the hope that it will heal your relationship. That starts to become a little bit redundant because you can continue unpacking it. But what often happens is then if I'm unpacking all my trauma and doing really deep work to do so, I might add, that is heavy lifting to do that and to look at those shadowy parts of ourselves. I'm, for example, doing all of that work and then I come to you as my partner and I lay it all out on a silver platter. And bringing you along on the journey as I'm uncovering more and more. And that's beautiful. That's really vulnerable. And that vulnerability needs to be held as a great gift and responsibility. And there is a certain point at which am I also perhaps placing expectations on you? And this is what I often see and have experienced myself of unspoken expectations of how I expect you to handle me, treat my trauma, and then being disappointed and perhaps resentful when you don't make me feel safe, secure, seen, heard, and understood to infinite possibility.
Okay.
As opposed to me taking more responsibility for that for myself.
Let's look at two things here. One is this piece of there's a place where it starts to become redundant. And I'm curious what you think is the place where it is actually valuable, and when does it start to turn from something valuable in terms of understanding the traumas that I've experienced. And probably should talk about what that really means by trauma. And then the second part is, what is the expectation that we're looking for our partner to hold, and how do we communicate that to them?
I think that the point at which expecting it to heal your relationship becomes a little bit redundant is when you notice that you are still repeating all of the same patterns anyway, despite having gained all of the self-awareness about what has happened to you.
And that can be really frustrating.
Yeah.
Right? Is that I feel like I've healed this. Why isn't there something changing? Why isn't this having an impact? Why am I still doing the same thing? We start beating ourselves up.
Or why am I still having the same thing done to me? Or my picker is wrong, clearly, because of my trauma.
Well, that's a good one, right? Because if my picker's wrong, then I have to make a clear decision, right? Then I've made the wrong decision with this person, which basically cuts off this conversation. There's no healing to be done here because it's my picker that's off. I've been in that conversation.
Sure. Right? And if I am operating from the story that my picker is wrong, well, guess what? I chose you as my partner.
Yeah.
So then I'm going to continue to operate and treat you, even unconsciously, from that belief, that underlying belief. And that kind of dooms the relationship in a lot of ways. And it's only a matter of time at that point before that falls apart, because I'm continuing to perpetuate that story.
And it removes our responsibility from the person who has their picker off, right?
Yes.
I made a mistake in the past. I can't resolve that problem now.
Because of what happened to me.
Because of what happened to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've all been there. You say one thing, your partner hears another, and suddenly we're off to World War III.
Those moments aren't about who's right. They're about what's unhealed.
That's why we created the Relational Compass. It helps you see your triggers, your strengths, and how to turn conflict into connection.
5 minutes, powerful insights, totally free.
Find your direction at lipcouples.com/compass and start loving in practice.
So let's talk a little bit about that, like trauma. What does that mean, the trauma that has happened to me, and how does that become a part of my system that then is impacting my relationships?
Well, for one thing, I want to be really clear that trauma is very subjective. And something that can be deeply traumatic for one person might not be for someone else, but that doesn't make it any less traumatic for the person who experienced it as trauma.
Exactly.
I want to be really, really clear about that. A really dear friend of mine, his mother, actually, this illustrates this story perfectly. She underwent what by any standard would be considered molestation by family members as a child. But she never really thought about it that way. She didn't really think it was odd, simply because she didn't understand it. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know any better. She didn't know that it wasn't something that everybody did. And as an adult, much later in life, not even, a young adult, like way later in life, she started to really understand exactly what that meant. And she still, to this day, she's in her 70s at this point, doesn't really hold on to it as trauma, because that wasn't how she identified with it at the time. Now, other people could uncover that. It could have had the same experience, not understanding it in childhood when it was happening, and uncover it much later, and very much experience it as trauma and re-traumatizing. So again, it's a very big conversation. I don't know that we would ever be able to fully unpack trauma.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is it's not really about what happened to me, but how I metabolized that within my system. How did that experience be? How was that translated within my system? And what I hear you saying to a certain degree is, in that particular circumstance, there wasn't the shame that is commonly associated with that, and therefore she didn't have a similar experience to someone else that might have the shame trauma response added onto the experience itself. There's no doubt that experience in and of itself is on some level traumatizing. There is some experience that, we can all have different experiences of a hurtful thing, and it's really the question of how do we hold on to that. And the question that really comes to bear, that I think is really valuable, is what do I then do with that information?
Yes.
And I think the key piece to recognize is that the trauma. So there is an incident that happens. That incident happened to me, happened in my experience. And in that experience, I had a reaction to that. And my system said, ooh, that's not good. I don't want to have that reaction again. And so I created a strategy early in my life to keep me safe from having to have that circumstance ever again. And I think that's the really important piece here that we're looking at, is the difference between the thing that happened to me, how I responded to it, and then the strategies that I created moving forward in my life that would keep me safe from ever having to experience that again.
I think that's really beautifully put. I'll give another example of that. I'll use myself as an example in this one. If you've listened to previous episodes of the podcast, you've heard my story, but I was in a 9-year relationship. I found out I'd been cheated on for that entire time. And that alone, and yes, that was very traumatic for me, especially the way in which I found out and how it brought forth a total crumbling of my self-identity. But I also created a lot of strategies after that to protect myself from ever experiencing being cheated on again. And that created some armor that, especially earlier in our relationship, even though I had done a ton of work around that, from the moment that relationship ended years ago, I have been unpacking that and all the things. And you and I had to do a lot of work together around that. And ultimately, though, I needed to make the choice. I was ready for something different and to put down some of those strategies. And it still comes up occasionally. Sometimes it still makes itself known.
And so let's talk about that, right? Because you had that experience. You had the experience of someone doing something to you in relationship, right? And it probably didn't start there. It had triggered a sense of abandonment, a sense of wound, that core wound that was already present, right? And so in that, it reignited a strategy, perhaps something that you had done previously. So what did that look like for you? And if you can walk us back to how did that strategy play out then? How did it play out before? How did it start to play out in our relationship?
I think the word that's coming to mind is control. And I exercised an enormous amount of controlling behavior in that relationship, just in terms of I ran the household, I ran the show, I wore the pants in that relationship most of the time. And it was because I felt safer when I was doing that. And it didn't leave him feeling like he had a lot of autonomy. I've talked about that before, which I think ultimately led to, and I'm not taking it on the blame wise. He made his own decisions and his own choices. But I do think that perhaps contributed karmically even to the overall pattern of, well, then of course you're going to get the thing that you fear most. And in our relationship, there were still lingering elements of that. Again, we've talked about this a little bit on previous episodes, but of course I chose someone who has 2 ex-wives and still co-parents with both of them, one more so than the other with a younger child. And that is still very present in our lives. And early in our relationship, I had a lot of issues with that. And I was feeling the pull to try to exercise control. Now, first of all, you are not a man to be controlled, which is also what I love about you and drives me mad in those particular types of moments. But, I honestly think that I chose you in so many ways, again, somewhat unconsciously, because I knew that those wounds would be pressed on so that I could heal them. Yeah. Honestly.
But let's walk this back and really highlight this story, right? Because there's a clear kind of line, right? Because there's the experience that you had with your father.
Sure.
So your
Abandonment.
father leaves the family.
Yeah.
You feel a sense of abandonment, and in that time of abandonment, right? You feel that you have to take control of your family to a certain degree. You have to step in. You have to step up, and holding authority in your family becomes something that's really critical to your safety. You create safety for your mother, you create safety for others by this teenage girl coming in and holding authority.
Coming in hot.
Yeah, right. Do you want to share what that looked like at all? Or?
Have we talked about this? I don't. If this is a repeat, forgive me. But in the aftermath of that, my father was being very belligerent through the lawyers. He and I didn't have any contact at that point, but was refusing to settle the marital divorce agreement, and he finally at one point pressed a little too hard and took me off the car insurance, which meant, and I was just learning to drive. I was 16, and that was the wrong move because I have a late birthday. I was behind everybody else learning to drive. I was like desperate to learn to drive, and that he'd gone too far. And I wrote him a rather vicious letter demanding that he clean that up in so many words. And also threw in some other choice emasculating insults about his abilities as a father. But lo and behold, I got my way because next day it was fixed. A few years later, same situation. There was another financial issue in the, we thought, already settled agreement. And I won't bore you with the long version of the story, but I essentially did the same thing and got it settled again on behalf of my mother. To be clear, my mother never asked me to do any of this. This was my choice. And I felt a responsibility. And I was also looking for a pathway to project my anger. And it worked really well because I got my way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. So little Emily feels the experience of father leaving, of that loss, that disconnection. She learns early on that if I come in hot with my authority, show everybody that I'm in charge, that I will get what I'm looking for. I will get the connection. I will feel positive about myself. So there's the trauma, but there's really the response to the trauma. Then Emily gets into long-term relationship, starts replicating those same patterns,
Yeah.
starts holding authority and becoming really strict with that to maintain a sense of connection, to maintain that love, to make sure that this person was going to need her, that she wasn't going to be abandoned, she wasn't
they
going
won't
to be
leave me.
left, right? And so even though the circumstances that showed up in that relationship with the infidelity ended up becoming the grounds for the relationship, we walk away and we go, okay, there's my trauma. My trauma is I was abandoned and then this person let me down, and now I have to work on healing my trauma. I have to work on healing that part of me that is hurting and is acting out of that hurt, and looked at healing that. Right? So you did all the work. You went to Bali, you did the workshops, you did all the things.
Dozens of different healing modalities, all of the things. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. EMDR, like different therapies, all of it.
Right?
Yeah.
And then you come into this relationship and it becomes tense, and there become moments of challenge, and you revert back to a similar strategy, right? Let me see if I can hold authority here.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work in this one.
Yeah. I also am high on holding authority. You get two people in a relationship that are high on holding authority. Let me tell you, it can be interesting.
Now, I'm also very high on preserving peace,
Absolutely.
but we'll get to
We
that.
tend to trigger those
Yes.
aspects within each other. Right?
Yes.
And so we can see that clear journey. It's not necessarily the trauma. It's not necessarily the thing that happened to you that's creating an actual conflict in our dynamic. It's how I'm responding to that thing that happened that's now creating a new way of relating, or a stuck pattern of relating that keeps to be carrying over into a new relationship. And I keep wondering, why do I keep having these same fill in the blank experiences with a new person?
Yeah. And I would love to hear from you. Like, give us another example of how this impacts relationship, and where it can impact different relationships too. It can start to spill over, and what's showing up in one type of relationship might also be showing up in other areas. Are those strategies actually working?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that you can definitely see it it's most clear in my closest interpersonal relationships.
Of course. It's most obvious.
That's the place where I feel the most challenged, because how you see me matters to me.
Yeah.
How you see me matters to me. How anybody else on the street, walking down the street, they see me, it's very easy for me to go, whatever. They say you have purple eyes. You go, I don't have purple eyes, right? My partner says I have purple eyes. And what are you talking about? Why do you think I have purple eyes? That's ridiculous, right? I don't just go, I don't have purple eyes. The way that you reflect back to me matters. And so it's most pronounced, I think, in our most intimate relationships, whether that's a sibling or a parent or our most intimate partner. We're going to see it most pronounced there. But there's little aspects of these patterns that show up all over the place. I shared this with you. I was in a conflict recently, or I was witnessing a conflict recently where I started to see patterns showing up. And it comes back again to this holding authority one. And it was there was a wound around injustice. And a lot of us, I have that wound around injustice. And, when we have that wound, we have an experience in childhood that, we see this thing and it just goes, make an early decision. I am not going to allow that to happen. I watched people bullying other people. I'm going to stop the bully every time. I'm going to stop this injustice. When I was a kid, I would cry even when I was a little kid watching Martin Luther King speeches because I just felt so connected to this drive to stop this sense of injustice. What's really interesting is the patterns that we start to create in order to keep ourselves safe from that injustice or whatever it may be. So I was witnessing this one experience where someone was, just going at this person, and it was this, this strategy of a losing strategy in relationship is if we're arguing about what I said. If the conversation turns, and I'm guilty of this, if the conversation turns, no, I didn't say it that way, I said it this way. I didn't say it that way, I said it this way. Go back and look at it. This is the way I said it. And it's really important to recognize that in and of itself is anti-relational. The idea that there is going to be an absolute right or a wrong has no place in relationship. It doesn't really matter what the right answer was or the wrong answer was. That is a losing strategy in relationship every single time. And if I'm fighting against injustice with this losing strategy of trying to prove to you that I got it right and you got it wrong, I'm always going to get it wrong because I'm missing the connection. There's always space to say, hey, this is what I thought you said. If there's something else that you wanted me to understand, please let me know. What is it that you would like me to understand?
Getting curious.
Right?
Yeah.
So I might get you to say, you're right. I did say that. Finally, I got justice. But what ends up happening as a result of that? What's the impact that then happens? And then I have to look at that and say, okay, where else is that happening in my life? Who else is experiencing this version of me where I'm fighting tooth and nail to make sure that you understand exactly what it is that I'm talking about? And I am the guiltiest of this, have been in my life, right? With this black and white thinking of this is the way, this is the way. Fighting against this strategy, fighting against all of the injustice in the world, and I will not be treated with injustice. Not in my house. But that pattern becomes a creation of separation.
Do you want to be right or do you want to be in relationship?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we all heard that phrase. But I think it's really important to really recognize that is just one indication of the many patterns that are playing out in our relationship. And it's not about just seeking to be right. It's the pattern of holding authority. I'll go back to this over and over again. In our try that again. In our assessment, the Compass Guide, we look at these two really important structures of what happens in relationship when I feel that my dignity is challenged, and what happens in relationship when I feel connection is challenged. And on that dignity line, when there is an assault to my dignity, either conscious or unconscious, I start to think, this person's challenging my integrity. This person thinks I'm not smart enough. This person thinks I'm not good enough. This person thinks I'm not pretty enough. This person thinks whatever it is. It challenges my sense of self. And out there in the world, it's pretty easy to say, oh, yeah, I don't feel that challenge. But in my partner, in my intimate relationship, I feel that challenge. And so I revert to subtle or overt ways of holding authority or preserving peace. Holding authority means that I am going to challenge you with a wall of words, as I'm doing right now.
I don't feel challenged.
I get on a rant. Can't stop talking. I'm going to challenge you with a wall of words, or all of the information that I know, all of the reasons that I have researched this. And for someone like me, I research. I have lots of information. I've done all the research. I know all the exits. I know all the outlets. I know all the different ways of the physics that are involved, and I've rationally thought about all of these things. So it makes perfect sense. I'm making a logical argument. But really what I'm doing is I'm seeking to hold authority. because I feel challenged.
Is this a good time to share our yellow
Please,
conversation?
please.
I wasn't expecting that to come up in this particular conversation, but so Kelly recently came across a reel on Instagram where, and you explain the reel because you'll tell the story better.
Well, yeah. So I think it was really simple. I wish we'd find a link to it. I'll see if I can.
Yeah, we'd love to credit it if we could, but
Yeah, it was just this silly little meme with this woman walks up to her partner and says, "Honey, do you understand men?" Excuse me. It's this funny little meme where this woman walks up to her partner and she says, "Honey, do you understand women?" And he says, "Oh, yeah, I think I understand women." He goes, "It's just kind of like understanding what the color yellow smells like." She goes, "Yeah, exactly." And in that moment, it dawned on me, that's it.
guys, we're in the best place we've ever been in our entire relationship, and I honestly think it's partly because of that meme. Because lately, when you don't understand something about me, where I'm not making logical, rational sense, I'm perhaps making more emotional sense to me, but not as much rational sense to you. When it's, like not over the big things, but the smaller things, you're like, okay, so it just smells like yellow. I'm like, this is what yellow smells like? Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, babe.
Yeah.
And I feel somehow seen and understood. And I commented about that to you. And you said, yeah, but that's also a choice that you were choosing to feel seen and understood when I say that. And I was like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. And that's true. It is a mutual generosity.
Yeah. It's not so much about the story. It's not so much about the language. It's that we've created a shared language.
Yes.
That's what makes it valuable.
Yes.
We have our own inside joke that works for us. Not that that's going to work for anybody else, but that we have had this conversation. We've agreed that, I get too rational, and that's part of my strategy for keeping myself safe.
Part of the pattern.
Right? And I get to rewrite that by just going, I don't need to make sense out of this. Yeah. And when I say it smells like the color yellow, that's just me catching myself and saying, I'm not going to do what I do and try to make sense out of this. I'm just going to let it go and accept that you are a special human being that I don't need to understand. I just get to love.
And I can choose to feel understood by that. And when you say that, and I feel your energy and it's so genuine, I feel such joy from how hard I see you embodying breaking past patterns. And it's also inspiring too. This is sort of the idea of what one of my dear friends, Jade Tita, refers to, our friend Jade Tita, as the white pawn principle, where it's you go first. Like you are the one who has to go first, not expecting everyone else to go first. You have to go first. And then you get to see how others respond as a direct result. And you might be surprised that sometimes when you start breaking your own patterns, then other people are actually quite inspired and energized to start shifting their own as well. And this goes deeper than just the trauma. This is looking at the strategies, the patterns, the things that we've created, some of which we are often not aware of until it comes up in relationship, until perhaps we unpack some of our trauma and then start to notice the patterns that we've developed around that's coming up in relationship. But once you have the awareness around it, you get to start behaving differently. And we're going to continue deepening into this conversation around not just self-awareness, but taking it into the next steps, which is actual embodiment, behavior shifts, relational changes that can happen as a direct result.
Before we do that, I want to go back to one really important piece here, which is when does looking at your trauma, when is it beneficial? When does it become too much? And what are some of the pitfalls that we can get into when we focus on the trauma, and how can that potentially even be used against us in relationship?
There's a couple things with that. One is that I would say part of the issue is when you start living in the past, because trauma is inherently, by all definitions that tend to resonate for me, something that happened to you in the past. It's literally around the question of like, what happened to you, right? And that can be incredibly valuable. And at a certain point, are you continuing to be authentic to who you were or to who you want to become? And that is where the shift has to start to take place. And if you're catching yourself living in the trauma, replaying it over and over again, first of all, anything you can do to get support I hope that that's obvious at this point, but it may not be. Again, we are not downplaying the effects of trauma at all. So I want to be really clear that that's really important. And at a certain point, are you noticing that you are starting to shift positively as a result of that? Or are you living in this sense of not just this is what happened to me, but this is who I am? Mm-hmm. That to me is the line. And you may also need other people around you to help reflect that to you. And that could be very painful reflection to receive. But if you can be open to where there might be a shred of truth in that, if you're fortunate enough to have people around you and who are honest about that, who you can trust, that's really valuable. There was a second part of your question that
So there's over-identifying with the trauma, but there's also the sharing of the experience in a safe space where you can be witnessed and have the experience of normalizing that experience and allowing it to dissipate to some degree. And oftentimes we find ourselves doing that in relationship. So it's wonderful if I can find myself in a safe space, and I think a lot of the work that we do around healing trauma is about being witnessed, allowing that to be seen, to be heard, because we say that the shame can't survive in the light. And so the more that I can allow that part of me to come out, to be seen, and that's a lot of the work that I do in men's work, the more that I can normalize that experience, the more that I can be witnessed, the more that I can see that I'm not broken. So there's an experience that happens in that way. Many people don't have those kinds of communities. And so the only person that I have that I feel that I can trust is often my partner. Mm-hmm. The one person that I'm going to share the deepest, darkest secrets that I have. And then what happens is it gets weaponized against me.
Yes.
So let's talk about that.
That is one of, I would argue, the biggest ways to break trust in relationship. If my partner shares something with me that is deeply vulnerable, and part of the key is also what I consider to be vulnerable might be different than what my partner considers to be vulnerable. So getting to know those differences as well and getting curious about that, I think, is also really important. But that if I then use that against you later, let's just use the betrayal wound as an example again, like you are very familiar with that. If the next time I bring something to you where you sense that I'm trying to control or manage the relationship to protect myself, and because I'm having that sort of betrayal wound come up, that could rightfully be quite triggering for you, because you're like, hey, I'm not that guy. Like, I didn't do that to you. I've never done that to anybody. Like, how can you think that of me? Again, almost just like the internal conversation. Mm-hmm. But then that could come out in the form of throwing my wound back in my face by saying, that's your shit. This is just because you got cheated on for 9 years, or some version of that, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be so deeply painful to be in the receiving end. That's taking some of my deepest wounding and using it against me to gain ground in an argument, and to hold on to your own sense of self, to try to get me to change the way I'm seeing and treating you. Your pathway through that, this has never happened with us, by the way, I'm strictly just using this as an example, could, if you chose to take the path of using that wound against me, that could irreparably damage trust.
Sure. And it's, it's not that overt. Mm-hmm. It oftentimes is very covert in the ways that it comes in, and it comes in as a trigger that I might have. For example, I very early decided I was not going to be the guy that cheated on anyone. And that's because I had experience where, I had a father who was out there. You know, he had a lot of girls, and he was, you know, he's women, and he was talking to many different people at early age. I decided I was not going to be like that. So any hint that there is a suggestion that I'm like that guy becomes a challenge to my dignity.
And actually, I'm glad that you're bringing this up because, yes, we have not had the overt version, but we have definitely had the covert version of this, 100%.
Right. So then that becomes a challenge to my dignity. So when I feel my dignity is challenged, what happens for me? I go into holding authority, right? And how do I say I'm holding authority? I say, oh, that's your problem. You're doing this because you're hurt and you're broken and you're projecting it on me. And how dare you do that? I see what's going on. I have the authority. I'm the teacher over here. I know exactly what's going on. And that's not me. That's you taking all of your trauma and putting it on me. How dare you do that to me? Yeah. That's what it often looks like. It's very subtle.
Sure.
It's not like we just go, you know, you're broken because you had this happen to you and I don't want to deal with you anymore. But I see it all the time. I see it in wives of the men that I work with. I was speaking with a man the other day who was sharing with me about, you know, a lot of hard things that he's gone through and how, you know, his wife stuck with him through all of the hardship. And now, as on the other side, it gets thrown back in his face on a regular basis. You know, this is, you know, I stuck with you through all of these horrible things that you did. And there's a sense of, underneath it, it's fear. I'm afraid that you're going to lose me, you're going to leave me. And so I revert to holding authority by reminding you what I have done for you.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's important to recognize that there are valuable ways to bring this out. And we even do this with the couples that we work with. We create safe spaces where they can share and be witnessed in true, authentic vulnerability through these experiences, so that they can see that when these patterns come out, these patterns are protecting this little boy or this little girl that's inside. And this is the hurt and pain that this little girl, this little boy has had. And that is who is acting out with this pattern. So if we can just accept that, then hopefully, before I start reacting with my pattern, I can see this pattern for what it is. It's this person that I love having this response to something that has happened, triggering a strategy that is guaranteed to invite my strategy into the room if I let it. But if I disconnect from that and say, this is their experience and this is where they're going for, and I see them doing this right now, it's not going to challenge my dignity because I recognize that this is your pattern, this is what's coming up. And so I can start to interrupt that pattern. And once I can interrupt that pattern, then I can start to create closeness, co-regulation. And from that space, we can actually start to have a real conversation about what's going on.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing underneath that too is that the real key there is compassion.
Yes.
Both for yourself and for your partner. Because if this is sounding really complicated for anyone listening in terms of, you know, trying to figure out my partner's exact patterns or my own patterns or strategies or any of those things, if you can just approach your partner the next time something comes up and you're starting to butt heads a little bit and perhaps even trauma has entered the room, just starting with some curiosity and some compassion. And as you get more curious, genuinely curious, not asking very pointed questions where there is a clear rhetorical answer you have in mind. You're getting genuinely curious and truly listening, then it would be difficult for anyone who genuinely loves their partner, which I assume anyone listening to this podcast does, to not have compassion for their partner. And that will make it easier to spot the patterns and to do something differently with them, to create a new strategy.
And that's easier said than done.
It is.
It's easier said than done.
This is why we work with couples.
And it comes with practice.
Yes, exactly.
It does. Love in practice.
Love in practice. Yes, absolutely.
Have you ever noticed that kind of conflict that you have with your partner, how it feels different than with anyone else? Like no one else can quite trigger you quite the same way.
It is so true. We tell ourselves if they just stop doing that, everything would be fine. But what if it's not actually really about them?
Yeah. What if it's actually about what they awaken in us? You see, we don't choose our partners randomly. On some level, we choose people whose patterns mirror the very wounds that we're waiting to be healed.
That's why the same fights keep coming back, not because you're broken, but because life is giving you another chance to grow.
Exactly. And that's why we created the Relational Compass. It's not a quiz, it's a tool that helps you to see why you react the way you do and what's underneath those reactions.
Helps you find your true north, the place where you can respond instead of react and connect instead of defend.
You can take it for free at lipcouples.com/compass. It takes just a few minutes, but it might change how you understand every relationship in your life.